Hey, you guys. Here we are again for another Flickers of Fear, and it's still Folk Horror February. So today we are talking about a classic from the 1960s, and this is one of the ones that I really wanted to do this month because this was actually a movie that I had heard a lot about, particularly in regards to folk horror. It's one that comes up a lot when you're talking about it, and it was one that I had never seen before, so I went ahead and put it on the docket, not realizing that it was 3 hours long. So when I actually went to watch it, I said, I have a couple of hours, I'm going to watch that movie and then I can record a review of it. And I was like, oh no, it's 3 hours. So I actually had to kind of watch it in 2 sittings. Now, interestingly, when they released this film, which is called Kwaidan, by the way, in the United States, they actually cut it almost in half by taking out one of the segments. So I'll get into that in a little bit. So this movie, Kwaidan, which roughly just means ghost stories, came out in 1965 from Toho Studios, directed by Masaki Kobayashi. Now, this is actually an anthology of ghost stories. There are 4 stories in there, and almost all of them are adapted from kind of just folklore type stories that were collected in the books of a dude named Lafcadio Hearn. Now, he was a guy, I think he was born in Greece, so I think he was like half Greek, half British, but later on he actually moved to Japan, I believe, and married a Japanese woman, and was one of the people that was very instrumental in bringing Japanese folklore, translating a lot of Japanese ghost stories and folklore and stuff for a Western audience. So that's what most of these stories are from. He wrote a book that came out in 1904, which was called Kwaidan, Stories and Studies of Strange Things. And I believe 2 or 3 of the stories in the movie are from that. And then there's another story called The Reconciliation, which came from another one of his books called Shadowings that came out in 1800. And that was adapted for this story as well. Now, as I said, this movie is quite long. When this was released in the United States in the 60s, they actually cut out the entire second segment, making the movie a little over an hour and a half. But if you're going to go all in for the experience, which you totally should, then I would recommend, getting the Blu-ray. I believe the DVD only has the shortened version. I could be wrong about that. But they have a Criterion collection, because, as I said, this is considered a classic of Japanese cinema and of folk horror. But yeah, if you're gonna go all in for it, you might as well go all in. And to be honest, the shortened version, in my opinion, I think they took out the best segment, which I thought was really dumb. But okay, it's one of those things. It's like, why can you really question that decision? I don't know. But yeah, so this movie, it actually got very good. As I said, it's a classic. It got really good reviews when it came out. I believe it also got an Academy Award nomination the year it came out for Best Foreign Language Film. So this is broken into 4 stories, which are unrelated. They're all set during different historical time periods. And as I said, they're basically all folklore fairy tales. They're all ghost stories. A couple of them will probably seem very familiar to people who, know a lot about Asian horror, or even some of the stories have been adapted in Western cinema as well. So these are pretty common ghost stories, particularly nowadays when so many people are into Japanese films and manga and stuff like that. So a lot of these stories may seem familiar to you. So the first story that you have is actually called The Black Hair, and this was the one that was adapted from the story called The Reconciliation. So what happens in this one is that there's a guy who, he's like a swordsman, samurai type guy, and he lives with his wife, who is a weaver, and they live in Kyoto, and they're actually quite poor. And so the guy decides, I'm not having any more of this poverty bullshit, which, I feel that. I get it. You know what I mean? So he says to his wife, you're a good wife and everything, but I don't really like this poor shit anymore. So he kind of gets this offer to go work for this and go marry this kind of noble woman. So he divorces his first wife and takes off to marry the second one just to get her money. Now, not too long after this whole situation comes to pass, he figures out, wow, like this new wife of mine is really kind of not all that great. She's very selfish. She's kind of a bitch, to be honest with you. And he's like really not into it. And then he starts to feel bad, rightfully so, I should add, about the poor dutiful wife that he left behind, who just spent all day weaving and was, just always nice to him and shit like that. He's like, man, why did I just like leave that awesome wife back in Kyoto? And he starts feeling really bad, but he still lets quite a bit of time go by. I don't think they say specifically how long it is, but they do kind of say like, oh, years go by or whatever. So finally, he gets it together and he tells the second wife, look, I feel bad about leaving my first wife. I basically just married you for the money or what. I mean, she kind of knew that anyway. And he's like, so I'm out of here. I'm going back home. So he goes back home. And interestingly, when he gets back to his house in Kyoto, it looks kind of like a little bit like abandoned out front, like no one's done any yard work or nothing like that. But when he goes in there, his wife is still in there just weaving on her loom like always, and she looks pretty much exactly the same, even though it's been several years since the guy left. He thinks this is a little strange, but not strange enough to be like, uh-oh, supernatural shit's afoot or anything like that. So he comes back and he apologizes profusely, and he was just like, look, I just did it for the money. And it's like, then I realized I missed you, and, it was all this other stuff. So she, instead of being like super pissed off at him, is just kind of like, oh, don't feel bad on my account. I always felt like I wasn't a worthy wife to you and all this other stuff. And, now we can have all this time together. Or she says something kind of a little bit strange, like, oh, we just have this moment together, or we can live a whole lifetime in this moment or something like that. And he doesn't really think anything too much about that. And he's just kind of like, okay, awesome. So they spend this one last night together. But then when he wakes up the next day, he finds that the wife is actually long dead. She's pretty much mummified, skeletonized, the whole deal. So it was just kind of like an illusion that he saw her the way she was when he came back. So she's been like dead the whole time. And not only that, but not only is his wife dead, but then he also starts aging really quickly. So he basically just like ages over the course of like one day. Oh, and also his wife's black hair is attacking him. So there's that. Which I will say, this is a beautiful looking movie. Like I said, it's from the 1960s, 1965 this came out. But that's kind of the one like special effect that I will ding it for, is like there's one point where the black hair like attacks the guy, and you can see that it's just like very obviously just like a black wig on a string. But it was just like a really like quick thing, so it didn't bother me that much. But I did see like, oh, it's on a string, you know what I mean? But yeah, so that was that whole story. And then the second story is actually called The Woman of the Snow. Now, to me, I think this is the best one. And weirdly, as I said earlier, when they released this in the US, this was the segment that they took out, even though I think this was the best one. But, go figure. So yeah, so The Woman of the Snow, she's a Yuki-onna, which I guess that's a yokai. So it's kind of like, like I said, it's a folklore type of female spirit. So you have these two guys, and they're out doing what they're doing. I think they're cutting wood or something. And they get stuck out in this blizzard. And so they're trying to the snow's blowing everywhere. So they go and hide in this hut. And while they're in there, the older guy, the older woodcutter, he gets killed or dies because the Woman of the Snow, the Yuki-onna, comes and breathes on him and frosts him, and he dies. And she's going to kill the other one, too, whose name is Minokichi. But then she says, no, you're pretty young and you're kind of handsome, so I'm going to let you live, but don't ever tell anybody about any of this shit, or I'm going to come back and kill you. So he's like, okay, can do. Now, not too long after this experience, he's traveling somewhere along the road, and he meets a young woman who is on her way to Edo. Now, her name is Yuki, And you would think that he would, I mean, I think a couple of years had passed at this point, because I think later on they established that he'd kind of like not forgotten about the weird Woman of the Snow thing, but enough that he didn't really like remember. So I'm sure it will surprise no one to know that this woman is the Woman of the Snow, but she looks like normal. So they meet. He's like, hey, why don't you come back to my mom's house? Like, we'll make you some food and then we'll, get you back on your way or whatever. But then they end up falling in love. They get married. They have 3 kids, and everything is wonderful and happy, and they're super delighted with one another. So they're married for 10 years. Several other women in the village are kind of always, I don't want to say catty necessarily, but they're always kind of saying, man, Yuki always looks so young, even though she's had 3 kids. How the hell do you think she manages that? Pilates? I don't know. But yeah, so they're all kind of like, they're all catty about the fact that she looks really young. Spoiler alert, like I said, it's because she's fucking supernatural, but nobody seems to twig onto that fact. So as I said, they're very, very happy for 10 years, but then one night comes when Minokichi is making sandals, new sandals, because it's New Year's, making new sandals for the kids and making new sandals for his wife. And while she's making like a new kimono, and while she's over there like sewing or whatever, he looks at her and he says, gosh, in that light, you looked just like this woman that I met like 10 years ago. And then you're like, uh-oh, don't do it. And then he tells her he's like, the damnedest thing like 10 years ago, and I'd kind of forgotten a lot about it, but you look just like her now, just then. And so he tells her the story, at which point, obviously, she turns back into the Woman of the Snow. She's like, motherfucker, she doesn't say that, but she says, motherfucker, I told you not to tell anybody, or I was going to kill you. I'm the Yuki-onna. Everything was happy. You had to go and fuck it up. But she does kind of go back on her promise. She's like, look, I would kill you, but we got these kids here, so I'm not gonna, because, I presumably she didn't want to leave the kids orphans. So she said, but if I ever hear that you are not taking good care of these kids, I'm gonna come back and fuck you up. And then she like leaves and goes back out into the snow and fades off into the distance. And I think that some of you, and I've seen other people mention this as well, because when I was watching it, I was like, hello, Tales from the Dark Side? Yeah, Tales from the Dark Side, that horror anthology movie. When the fuck did that come out? The early 90s, I want to say? It was the late 80s or early 90s. It was supposed to be Creepshow 3, but then it was a whole thing. And it's one of the stories in there, the one with Ray Don Chong in it, was basically the same thing, where like a guy meets like a hot woman and they get married and have kids and everything. And but it turns out she's really a demon. And she just, so the demon made a deal with him. Look, I won't kill you if you don't tell anybody about me. And he's like, okay, I can do that. But then years later, like, he tells his wife about it, and then she turns back into the demon, and she's just kind of like, I told you not to say anything, you fuck around. Sorry. So it's pretty much the same story as that. So I think, honestly, this was my favorite of all of the stories. All of them are pretty good. The last one's kind of a little thin, but we'll get to that in a second. But I think this was my favorite one, so that's why I think it's like kind of ironic that this is the one that they chose to take out. But I don't know, whatever, it was a little weird. So the third one is actually called Hoichi The Earless, which is a great fucking title. And this one is by far the longest of all of them. Honestly, Hoichi The Earless, I think, is almost long enough to be a movie in its own right. I think it's like a little bit over an hour. So this actually deals with a young blind man named Hoichi, obviously. And he plays the biwa, I guess is how you pronounce it. It's like a lute type thing. And so he kind of goes he can go from place to place, and he sings like all these epic sagas of like all these battles and stuff. And his specialty is going around and chanting or singing the what's called the Tale of the Heike, about the Battle of Dano-ura, which was these 2 clans that fought. And so you can kind of see like they show like these big sea battles, and it's this big epic shit, and there's ritual suicide, there's a whole thing. So Hoichi actually kind of like sits there and plays the biwa and chants like the story about it. So he's kind of at this temple. I guess he's like a temple attendant or something. And so the other guys there kind of look after him and feed him or whatever. So he's kind of out on the porch playing his biwa one night, and this guy in armor sidles on up to him. Now, he can't see the guy. But the guy says, hey, we heard that you were like the best biwa player around, and we heard that you could sing this like saga, so my lord would like you to come and play for him. So he's like, okay, I can do that. So, but it's like the middle of the night. So it turns out that so Hoichi goes to this place, and there's this whole big like retinue of people, man. It's like a big temple, and there's just like people everywhere. You know, there's just a whole fucking royal family, like an emperor kind of shit. It's a whole thing. So he just sits there and he plays his biwa and sings the whole saga. Now, as it turns out, like I said, this isn't really spoiler alerts because a lot of these stories are pretty commonly known, and even if you're watching them now, because they've been retold and stuff like that so many times, like it's not like any of them will be super surprising or anything. These are all ghost stories, so you can pretty much figure out where it's going. So all of these are ghosts of people that were actually killed in the battle, you know, many 100 years ago or whatever, like that he's singing about. But because he's blind, all he can just hear their voices and like sense them around and stuff, but he can't see them. And they kind of look like people, but when they show like the guy coming up to him like at the porch, when you can kind of see through him, he's a little bit transparent, but obviously the blind guy can't see that. So he does this a few nights. The ghost tells him, you know, even though he doesn't know it's a ghost, he says, you know, look, don't tell anybody where you are. So he kind of gets into an awkward situation at the temple because he's out all night and he's looking kind of like sickly, and everybody is asking him, just like, where are you taking off to in the night? You got a girlfriend or what the fuck? And he's like, oh, I just had some stuff to do, and he just like won't tell them. But after a while, the guy that runs the temple figures out like what's going on, and he's like, oh my god, you can't ever like do what a ghost asks you to do, because now he's gonna like suck all your soul or whatever, and that's not good. So he's like, so what we need to do is he's like, you're gonna die if you keep doing what these ghosts want. So he's like, okay, well, what we're gonna do is we're gonna take you and we're gonna paint. And this is actually one of the most iconic images from the movie, I feel like, because it's even like on the cover, like, so it's like Hoichi, like his face with all of these characters like painted all over. So like, okay, we're gonna paint the Heart Sutra, and we're just gonna paint it over every single inch of your body. And then if we do that, you sit out on the porch. When the ghost comes, he won't be able to see you, and you just have to like sit there. Don't be scared. You know, if the ghost talks to you, don't answer him. Just like sit there still and don't answer, and we'll just keep playing it that way until the ghosts like get bored, I guess, and like don't come back anymore. So they do that. However, the guy that's painting the characters on there, I mean, he really fucking dropped the ball on this. You would think this is like the first time that he painted a Heart Sutra on everybody so that he can't be seen by the ghost, but he fucks it up. And I'm sure that you will probably figure out, because the name of this story is Hoichi the Earless, he forgets to paint the characters on Hoichi's ears. So when the ghost comes, he doesn't see Hoichi at first, but then he's kind of like looking, being like, what the fuck? I see his biwa there, and it's like, I feel like somebody's there, but I can't see anybody. But then he just sees the ears. So he's like, well, damn. He's like, well, I'm going to pull those ears off and take them back to my lord as proof. Like, I did come here and try to get the kid. He's not here, but there's these ears, so I'm going to rip them off. So this poor blind kid, through no fault of his own, just because he was a good biwa player, this ghost shows up. He doesn't even know it's a ghost because he's blind and he can't see it. And so this poor kid gets his fucking ears torn off. You know, I felt really bad. So yeah, he gets his ears torn, and I have to say, like, the dude, like the guy at the temple that like painted the characters on him, like, he felt bad, but I feel like he didn't feel as bad as he should have felt. You know what I mean? He was just kind of like, oh man, my bad, I forgot the ears, rats. And I'm just like, yeah, cool, that's real cool. So yeah, so now this kid got his ears torn off. But I guess it all works out in the end, because the ghosts don't come back after that because they think that Hoichi is gone. They've got his ears and they don't return. And it ends up that because of this whole story, Hoichi gets so famous because of his singing of the sagas, and in particular this one battle that he always sings about. So he gets like all these actual living people that pay like shit tons of money to to hire him to sing it for the thing. So that's the thing too, is like when he goes, like when you see him go and play for all the ghosts, that's what it looks like to us. But when other guys like go and like pull him away, they're like, there's nobody there. You're in a big cemetery. And that's where because they show like, it's just all these gravestones. So that's like where all the guys from where all the people from that battle were. So he loses his ears, but he does end up really, really rich, like essentially like a rock star of the day. So I guess it all worked out okay in the end. Now the last story, again, this one was a little strange because I feel like, I don't know if this one was like actually unfinished or if they were just saying it was unfinished and they're kind of like making a meta joke about it. I didn't really get that. So this last one, which is actually quite short, is called In a Cup of Tea. It's almost a little bit like a Twilight Zone episode, I want to say. Because there's a guy, it's like I said, it's a little bit meta. It's like there's this writer and he's telling the story and he's just like, yeah, we got this story, but it's not finished, but we're going to tell you what we got. So he's like, okay, there's this dude named Second Eye, and he's going someplace and he stops to get a cup of tea, like at a tea house, and he looks in the tea and instead of seeing like his own reflection or whatever, he sees like this random ass dude's reflection that's like smirking at him really creepily, and he's like, what the fuck is that all about? And which is weird. You wouldn't think that you would drink the tea after that, but he's just like, fuck it. So he just like drinks the tea anyway. Now, at this point, like, so he gets another cup of tea later and sees the same random ass dude in there. And at this point, the guy says, his name is Hanai Shikibu, I think is how you pronounce it. And so Second Eye is just like, hey, I just saw this random ass dude and he said what his name is, he was in my tea. And they're just like, what the fuck ever, bro, okay. And they don't believe him. But later on, here's the weird thing. Later on, like that dude does actually kind of pop up in his house and like, hey, I'm a ghost. Hey, I'm over here. And he does that, but like, you know, and the guys don't believe that he saw him. But then later on, like these 3 other dudes show up at his house that say, oh, we're attendants of this guy that you saw in your tea. And he says that you assaulted him with your sword or something. So we're here to take revenge on you. So then they have a big sword fight. But then that's the end. You know what I mean? Like I said, because they said it was unfinished. So the author, like I said, the writer inside the story, this is getting complicated, but he says, yeah, well, I could have written an ending for this, but I think I want to leave it to you guys' imagination. But then in the same story, like this publisher comes to see the writer, and then the writer, like the writer's face is trapped inside the tea now too. So you know what I'm saying? So that does actually seem like an end, even though you don't see what happens to Second Eye. But then the same thing happens to the writer. So like I said, I don't know if it's actually unfinished or they're just making a joke and it's like meta and I'm not getting it. I'm not really sure. But that last one, like I said, I think is the weakest one. And it's really strange that they kind of, that they put it at the end like that, particularly after Hoichi the Earless, which, like I said, was very, very long, which was, you know, more than an hour long. And then you have this last one, which is like 10 minutes or something, like 10 or 15 minutes. I just thought that was really bizarre. I think they did kind of structure it that each story was supposed to represent a different season, which you can't, it's not super obvious, I guess. Like Woman of the Snow is obviously like a wintertime one, but I didn't really get the sense that each one was supposed to be a different season, but that's kind of like what I gleaned from like reading about it. So now this movie, as I said, it's quite long. It's more than 3 hours, I think 3 hours and 3 minutes, something like that, if you get the complete version. And I will say that this is a movie that you definitely have to commit to, because not only is it very long, but it is very, very, very slow. I mean, it's the whole like structure of it is very much like a very, very deliberate. It's almost kind of like, because all of it is filmed on sound stages and there is no, there's really no effort made to disguise that fact. They want it to look artificial. And in that way, I actually really like the look of this because it's almost like you're going to see like a big elaborate stage play. And they do some really cool shit with it. Like I said, Women of the Snow, where they have this whole like snowy forest like on a soundstage, and then they have these crazy like painted backdrops in the back that are all these crazy colors, and like it looks like all these swirling clouds, but they all look like eyes, so like all these like eyes are looking at you like from the sky. And then later on, like when it's kind of like in that same story, when it's kind of like summer, the sky in the background is all these like red swirls, and it looks really cool. But like I said, it's not trying to look realistic. It's trying to look, you know, it's very much like reveling in its artifice. During the Hoichi The Earless segment, there's also like a big sea battle, but it's staged the way that you would see a big sea battle staged, like I said, maybe like in an opera or something like that. It's very elaborate, but they're not trying to hide that it's artificial. They're just kind of like leaning into the artifice. And I think that was actually a really good idea because it gives this a very otherworldly kind of vibe to it, because you can tell it's not real. You know, it's set during historical time periods. They're all based on folklore and fairy tales. So they're not really trying to be realistic in any sense of the word. So it is like very fantasy based, and the cinematography is really, really beautiful. The sound design is great. It doesn't really even have, I don't want to say it doesn't have a score, because it does in parts, but it makes like really great, creepy, like unsettling use of like strange, like incidental sounds. You know what I mean? Kind of like tapping and knocking and things like that. And it makes a lot of use of silence as well, which, you know, if you've seen it, you kind of know what I'm talking about. But it's very spare. And really the whole thing is kind of like that. So as I said, just keep in mind that this is very, very deliberately paced. I saw like another reviewer that said it was stately. I was like, that's a good word for it. If you're not in the mood for it, then you might just be like, what the fuck? Like everything is taking forever like to happen, which I get that. But if you're kind of just willing to let it sit with you, let it kind of do its thing, then there's something kind of like hypnotic about it, like in a really weird sort of way. As I said, some of the stories are stronger than the others. Woman of the Snow is probably my favorite one. And really, I think the only weak one is the last one, just because it's so short and it seems kind of like, is that it? Particularly because it was the last one. You'd think they'd kind of maybe want to go out with a bang or whatever. And it just seemed like a strange choice to like kind of just tack this short one on the end, particularly after, you know, the Hoichi the Earless segment, which was really, really long and very involved and almost kind of like a movie on its own. So the last segment just seems like a little bit of an afterthought. And I do kind of wish that maybe it had been fleshed out a little bit more. But on the whole, I mean, if you like Japanese cinema and you're kind of willing to meet the movie halfway, you know, and if you're willing to like make the commitment to it, I mean, it's beautiful to look at. The acting is amazing. It does actually have some really creepy imagery and just like I just really like the whole like vibe of it, I guess. But you know, like I said, keep in mind it is very, 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 very slow, and that's like that's a lot like coming from me, because I don't mind that at all. But even me, like a couple times, I gotta say, like a couple times I was like, yeah, this is starting to try my patience a little bit. But if you stick with it, it's just like a whole experience. Like I said, it's almost kind of like sitting through an opera a little bit. So yeah, if that sounds like something you, and you know, tell me if you guys have seen it, because I know this is a classic. I had never seen it, and I really felt like, well, I really need to get around to watching this, because I feel like this is one that a lot of people bring up. And I feel like when I was thinking about doing Folk Horror February, I said, well, I at least want to do some, you know, at least one Asian cinema, you know, pick. And I picked this one specifically because I had not seen it, and I wanted to rectify that. So I'm actually glad I have seen it now. So if you guys have seen it, let me know what you thought about it in the comments. If you'd like to watch it, I actually just rented it on Amazon Prime. I think it was just $3.99 or something like that. Like I said, it's 3 hours, so set aside a good chunk of time to watch it if you're going to, because I didn't realize it was that long when I first started watching it, so I had to kind of break it up into 2 chunks because I didn't have time to like watch it all at once. But you know, it was definitely worth watching, and it's definitely an experience. So let me know what you thought about it in the comments if you've seen it, and I will be back on another one. We're still doing Folk Horror February. We got a couple more of those to go. So yeah, I will see you guys again on the next one. Bye.